Look, I am sorry, all of Middle America, but if I have learned anything from horror fiction, it's just simply that you should never go into a cornfield. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for joining me today. So today I wanted to do a review of the Clown in a Cornfield Trilogy by Adam Cesare. So this is the Clown in a Cornfield, Clown in a Cornfield 2, Friendo Lives, and Clown in a Cornfield 3, The Church of Friendo. And, I didn't catch this first book when it came out, and I only heard about it when the second book was being released. I thought it sounded interesting, and I kind of put it on my mental TBR, but didn't do anything else. And then I saw the third book was being released, and I said, I really want to read this trilogy, and it moved a little bit up my mental TBR. But then I saw that there was a movie coming out of the first film, and I said, okay, I need to read this trilogy before the movie comes out. I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to see the movie, but I definitely want to have read the novels before the movie comes out. So at the time of recording this review, the movie hasn't been officially released yet. There are a number of trailers, and it has been screened at some horror festivals, and I've heard some things about it, and I'll talk about that at the end of the video. So I did get a chance to read the whole trilogy before the movie comes out, and I'm really glad I did. Now, this is a YA slasher trilogy, and it's YA in the sense that the themes and the ideas are really about coming into yourself and learning who you are. There isn't any hot and heavy, steamy sex action on the page. There is violence. There's a good deal of violence, but these are all kind of accepted now in YA stories. So it's YA in the same sense that I think the movie Scream is YA. Let's put it that way. The characters in the first novel are high school seniors, and then they age up from there. Now, I'm not going to have any spoilers for the series. So the second and third books I'm only going to talk about in vague terms, though I think they do interesting things that I want to talk about. But I guess there's one small, very, very minor spoiler, and it's only a spoiler if you've never read slasher fiction before, or watched a slasher movie, or understand how a final girl works. So that very, very minor spoiler is that our main character, Quinn, is a final girl. And so what do I mean by that is that she's in all three books. She makes it to the third book. Now, whether she makes it out of the third book, I'm not going to say, because our final girl doesn't always last a whole trilogy, but she does make it through all three books, and she's the central character in all three books. There are other characters that move across books, and there are new characters in books 2 and books 3. I'm not going to talk about who lives or who dies across those books. I'm not going to talk about who is a repeat character or not. So I'm going to leave all of that spoiler free for you to find out on your own. So the only minor spoiler is that Quinn, our main character, does make it to the third book. What I really liked about the story is, in many ways, it's a traditional slasher, and yet it is doing some things to subvert the genre that I think are fun and are interesting. So we set up in a very expected setup where we have a new girl, Quinn, and her father move from the big city of Philadelphia to small town, Kettle Springs, Missouri. And there's a dead mother involved, right? Part of what they're leaving Philadelphia for is to get away from the memory of their dead mother. And there's a whole bunch of things that go along with that, because of course there's a dead parent. This is a slasher about a troubled teen. There has to be a dead parent. And I say that jokingly, but he plays into the tropes of the genre, but he uses it effectively. It's not just window dressing. So it has an effect on her as a character. So they move into this small town. This small town has historically been focused around the production of corn syrup, right? That has been their major export and their major source of income, both because there's a huge factory there and then a number of farmers on the outskirts of the town. But for one reason or another, that has slowed down by the time she's gotten there. And so there is like an economic depression in this town, and they are wondering what it's going to take to build themselves up. So that is the setting we find ourselves in, and very quickly, within the span of the first few days of her there, you have this attack from Friendo. Now, Friendo is the mascot of the corn syrup company, the now defunct corn syrup company, but he's become like a mascot for this whole town. And so a bunch of teenagers are getting murdered by Friendo, basically. That is the setup. And now, with slashers, you have a couple different varieties. You have the slasher variety that is taking its roots in the giallo genre of a masked assailant who is murdering people. And part of the fun of the story is figuring out who the murderer is and why they are engaging in this. There's usually some twisted motivation for it. As opposed to, you have your supernatural slashers, where the villain, you know who the villain is from the beginning, and they usually have some supernatural ability, whether it be Freddy or Jason or Michael Myers, who are kind of, the godfathers of that kind of slasher. So you have these two veins of slasher, and this very firmly sits in the first one, where you have this masked killer, and part of the fun of the story is figuring out why this killing is happening, not just trying to avoid it, right? So you have these two things going on. But everything is happening so quickly. It's not like there's a mystery to unsolve. It's not like you have the time to sit and analyze clues, because you're always running for your life. And that is one of the fun things about the story, is that the characters don't have any opportunity to relax. Once the action starts, it doesn't stop. It's relentless in that regard. And the reason it works is because the characters are great. I think all the characters do really well. Now, when you have a slasher, right, you have these stereotypical characters that you find. I think the movie Cabin in the Woods did a great job of showing that, every slasher story has the prude, the jester, the intellectual, the jock, and so forth. So you have these different archetypes, and you find those in this story. You have the jock, and you have the hillbilly, and you have maybe not the slut, but someone that's leaning in that direction. And of course, the new girl who embodies innocence. And yet, even though he plays into these character types, he also subverts them because none of the characters are that simple. So even for high school seniors, all of these characters are fun, they're interesting, they feel real. They feel like the kind of kids you'd meet in a small town in the 2020s. So they feel genuine. And even if they're playing into certain slasher tropes, I think that they do it in such a way that never feels forced. For as unrealistic as the slasher story may be, it feels realistic, if that makes sense, at least from a character point of view. So I think making characters that you care about, that you feel invested in, and then immediately putting them in danger, and then not holding back once that danger starts, but just escalating and escalating, I think is really effective. So this first story, I think, is a fun ride the whole time. And like I said, it is subverting some of the expectations of the slasher genre. I won't go into too much how it's doing that, because to do that would give away some things. And to be honest, I think any slasher that comes after the movie Scream has to have some sort of meta aspect, right? It has to be aware of itself. I think Scream really changed the game for how slashers can exist, at least contemporary slashers, if you don't want to do a throwback. And then, the Angel of Indian Lake trilogy by Stephen Graham Jones that wrapped up last year also had this very meta aspect. And I think both of those things, both in film and in writing, in novels, have changed what it means to write a slasher series. That you have to have some aspect of knowing yourself, knowing who your characters are, knowing how they exist in this metaphorical space. And I think Adam Cesare does a great job of that. He is a former educator, and I think that plays into the way he writes these teenage characters, because they do feel genuine and you feel that he cares about them, right? And you care about them as a result, yet he puts them in really awful situations. And so he takes these ideas of running away from a masked man and he amplifies it. And I think he is using this genre to look at some really interesting questions. You have this small town that on its best day is still going to be somewhat economically disadvantaged. And being a small town in Missouri, it already has a certain type of perception about it that goes on from the rest of the country, especially from the coastal elites, quote unquote, or from people from big cities. Any small rural community has, these preconceived notions that surround it. And so you have this small town that all of a sudden is experiencing greater economic depression. And you have these teenagers who are coming into adulthood, but don't have anything to look forward to. Like, this is the life they're living in the 2020s, where the economy is ruined and their own small town is ruined. All of these fissures that were essentially lying dormant under the town are now exacerbated and are growing bigger and bigger. And the generational divide about what is right for the town is getting wider and wider. So what the adults think is the best way to move forward, and what the kids expect of their adults and of their family and of their peers, those are wildly different things. And looking into that generational divide and how the kids fight for their life is a really smart thing, because one trope common in YA horror, or in YA in general, is that the parents and the adults are always wrong. Like, they're not the source of safety that they're supposed to be, right? That is a common trope. The kids figure out something is wrong. They tell the adults, who are supposed to be the ones to help them or save them, and the adults ignore them, say they're crazy, say that whatever they're saying is made up. And so the kids are left on their own to fight the big bad, to fight evil, to do whatever it may be to survive. And this takes that idea and it explodes it. It makes it even bigger. So what does it mean when you aren't just not believed by the adults, by the generation above you, but you are actively looked down upon by them? That not only do they think that you're lying, but they don't think you're worthy of help anyway. So that generational divide is something that he is exploring, and I think the novel is just a really clever way to do that. It does get wild. At the end, there is a pretty decent body count. There are some reveals that I didn't expect to happen, and that is always delightful to me. I guessed some of what was going on, but I didn't guess the whole thing. It went much further than I had expected it to when it gave its final reveal of who the killer is, and I thought that was great. I think that it's hard to surprise readers who love this genre, because we just consume so much of it that it's hard to catch us on our back foot, but I think Cesare does a good job of it. And very smartly, going into the next book and the third book, he doesn't stay in the exact same lane. So the second book starts with Quinn at college, right? So it's just the next year. She is at college, but things happen. And at first you think, oh, this is just going to be Scream 2. So you just take the main character, put them in a new location, and have the same things happen again. But that's not what happens here. It is the same character in a new location at college, but events occur that cause her to go back to her hometown. So you also introduce a new character who is the point of view from the hometown, and our main character Quinn ends up returning to the hometown. One of the things he did that I thought was really fun in the second story was new people came to the town who set up basically a haunted maze or a fright fest that is exploiting this popularity of the town as being the site of this massacre, which is obviously in really bad taste. Yet it's also a chance for the town to gain some sort of economic foothold because they are in such an economic depression, and their factory jobs and the wealth that they used to have from growing corn or from producing corn syrup, that doesn't really exist anymore. Even though this is this really morbid idea to set up a fright house on the field of a massacre where all these teenagers lost their lives, it also introduces new characters, it introduces a new dimension, and it again highlights the rifts between opinions of different characters and how they look at the world in different ways. What they expect of the world is different. What they expect the world to give them, or to how the world to treat them, and how they expect to live in the world is different. So I think it's a really smart thing. It is adding a meta layer without being too obvious about it. And also, just like creating a haunted house or a fright fest at the site of a massacre, it's like such a ballsy thing to do. So to introduce that in this novel, I think is great. I think it's a great environment, a great atmosphere. And the second story plays out again in ways that part of it is expected and part of it is unexpected. I think something that the Scream movies and Angel of Indian Lake showed clearly is that there are rules to slasher films and to slasher novels. One of them is, in the sequels, the body count is always higher. And in some ways, Cesare manages to avoid this, where he doesn't fall into the trap of just making everything bigger and bloodier for the sake of it. There is still a gruesome body count in this second novel. I don't think it's as big as the first, but the deaths that happen are meaningful. It isn't just side characters that are fluffed off just for the sake of adding to your body count. So he subverts a little bit of your expectation of what's to come from the genre, but he does it in a way that makes those deaths meaningful, which is not something you expect, right, from a slasher. You don't expect the deaths to be meaningful. You expect them to be gruesome and bloody and almost laughable. And he doesn't do that. He says, no, you should care about these people, and then I'm going to kill them. And so I appreciated that a lot. And then the third novel is even wilder, because where would you go after that is you'd go on a road trip. And I don't want to give away anything else, but the third novel is essentially a road trip novel, which is not what you expect. And it adds a whole nother dimension to the story and to the ongoing storyline of Frendo, this mascot, who embodies these small town ideals. And what happens when Frendo is a murderer, and also the embodiment of a certain nostalgic, make America great again, idyllic small town community, right? How are those two things? How do they coexist? What happens when you idolize the past in such a way that you take it to a logical extreme? And how does that affect your present or your reality? What happens when you invent a past and say that this invented past, this invented history, is what we need to return to by any means necessary, whether that be manipulation, lying, violence, coercion, whatever it may take. So obviously Adam Cesare is commenting on our current political situation, on what it means to be looking forward or looking backward, what it means to have generational divides as well as social divides, economic divides, political divides, and how all those things are creating an environment that does nothing but breed violence and disruption. And then if you want to survive that, if you want to survive that type of polarity, what do you need to do? What do you need to rally within yourself to find a way to overcome hatred and vitriol, to overcome that disconnection, that fundamental malaise that has kind of taken root in American society and caused all of our crops to rot and wither? That is what he's asking. And so this third novel is almost more explicit about that, though it's an explicit theme that goes through this whole trilogy, right? But the third novel, you're on a road trip again with Quinn, and she has survived these first two novels, so she is traumatized, she is changed, she is transformed, and now she's on this road trip. And I won't go into more details than that, except that as the end of a trilogy, it does not do at all what you'd expect it to do. Like even being a road trip novel, usually the trilogy goes back to the beginning. It starts at the source, and this doesn't. It does something different. And it was really refreshing. It felt appropriate for the story, and it worked really, really well. So that is my broad overview of the trilogy. I think that the characters are really well developed, and the characters that do go from book to book, and even the ones that don't, they all have growth. They all have a journey, and that's not something you always expect in a slasher novel. Yet he manages to imbue a pathos into all of the characters, even the ones that you don't like, that makes them people that you want to spend time with at least you want to spend literary time with them. I don't know if I'd want to hang out with a lot of them, but the characters develop and grow, and they go on an inner journey. They aren't just cannon fodder, which takes a skillful hand to do. The writing itself is fun. It's descriptive. It has a lot of momentum. It never really slows down. The dialogue feels realistic. It feels natural. There's nothing about it that feels forced in any way. The situations that the characters find themselves in, obviously they are, exaggerated, because I hope I'm not going to be hunted by a crazy killer wearing a clown costume. Yet they feel realistic to the world. They don't feel out of place given all of the other things that have been put into place in this world building that he's done. The world building itself, I think, is exquisite. You get this small town feel, and you especially get this fish out of water feel with Quinn. And as she moves into the second and third novels, and she tries to settle into what it means to be part of this small town, be part of this community, to have survived this massacre and be known for that, what kind of popularity and what kind of fame and what kind of infamy does that lead her? I think that is something that he plays with really well, and that helps build the world, and it creates tension in the world. So the world building, I think, is great. And ultimately, I think the story is just a lot of fun. He's using the slasher genre to look at generational divides and political divides and ask questions about society, which I think is what's most fun about it. He isn't just asking about individuals, and he isn't just asking about trauma. He isn't just looking at, what happened if your parents didn't love you. He's looking at this blight upon all of society and saying, how can this masked killer, who is the mascot for a town, how can that represent a bigger problem in society? And it's never heavy-handed. Well, that's not entirely true. It's never heavy-handed in the sense that it feels like it's preaching to you. It is heavy-handed in a sense, and it's clear that Adam Cesare has a political position and a social position, and that even though he shows there's nuance to that, he's definitely taking a side in this argument. And that side is the side with the kids. He is taking the side for the future, which I think is the right side to be on. So I really appreciated this trilogy. I think it is a lot of fun. I think if you like slashers in general, if you like old school slashers, if you like giallo slashers, then this is going to be right up your alley. I think if you like there to be more meta commentary and more intellectualizing, then this is also going to be a lot of fun for you. It isn't just, like I said, hack and slash. There is more going on. He does create characters that you care about before he brutally murders them, which I think is not always the case, right, in the genre. So I really think there's something in this series for everyone. Now, if you don't like slashers at all, then you will be turned off, because he does lean into some of the slasher tropes, into some of the aesthetics of a slasher movie or a slasher novel in general. So if you're totally turned off by those, then you'll probably be turned off by this. But if you have any taste for it, I think what he does with the genre, what he does with the characters in the world, is really interesting, and it's a lot of fun. The books move really quickly. There isn't any slog. There isn't any real slowdown. There are periods of rest where you get to do some exploration of character and of interiority, but for the most part, once the bodies start falling, then they just keep falling, and our characters are in constant peril, both trying to figure out what's going on and save themselves at the same time. So everything here, I think, is balanced. I had a great time with it. I think you will too. Before I sign off, I will mention a little bit about the upcoming film, which I haven't seen, but I already have some concerns about. And to be fair, I think Adam Cesare, I don't know if he was an executive producer on it or he helped write it, but he was at least peripherally involved in it. With that in mind, I have some faith that it'll be true to the novel. But looking at the trailers and hearing some reviews from the festival that I already played at, and knowing the filmmakers, I have some concerns. So first off, the movie, I think, is much more of a horror comedy than just a straight slasher. So the filmmaker, who I think who's credited for writing the script and also is the director, is Eli Craig, and he is responsible for Tucker and Dale versus Evil. And so if you've seen that horror comedy blend is something he's really good at. So everyone says this is more of a horror comedy. It has much more comedy aspects than the novel does, and I think that's fine. But it all of a sudden, it makes me a little nervous, because I think the first novel is really great, and I think the story it's telling is really great, and I think that the ending is really great. I also hear that the body count isn't quite as high in the film, and that's a little bit depressing, because the way the first story ends is kind of jaw-dropping, and I really hope that isn't sacrificed for whatever they're doing in the movie. And then the kind of last thing that's a little bit, I understand it, but it makes me nervous, is that, Adam Cesare is very clear in his press material, so I don't feel like this is spoiling anything, that there isn't, a supernatural being. This isn't it. This isn't some demon entity that just happens to look like a clown. The killer is a human killer here that happens to be wearing a clown mask. And if you look at the film, you see a glimpse of the clown, of Frendo, or of the killer Frendo, in the trailers. And the mask is like really elaborate and beautiful, and this really full facial latex mask that looks really scary. Yet the whole point of the killer in the novel is that Friendo is the mascot of this town, and there's a whole bunch of these cheap Friendo masks that are mass produced that everyone has. And so part of the fear of the characters is everyone has these masks. These aren't special. You can't trace these masks. They aren't custom made, you know? So anyone could be Friendo because everyone has this mask. It's a mask and a set of like work overalls, you know, or a work jumpsuit. And so you're immediately given this sense of paranoia because literally anyone could be Friendo. Yet in the trailer, this mask is like super elaborate and scary, and there's no way that everyone has a copy of this mask. It's not mass produced. So that makes me a little bit suspect. Now, I understand from the point of view of wanting to market a movie, having a really scary clown mask is important and is enticing and will draw people in. So maybe it's fine. You know, maybe my concerns are overblown. I'm not actually going to let them prejudice my experience of the movie if I ever get a chance to watch it. And all the reports I have heard from people who have read the book and seen the movie said they enjoyed the movie. So maybe I am just worried about nothing. But it's still really exciting that this trilogy was picked up for a movie series. It's a young trilogy. Adam Cesare is a relatively young author. And so I think it's really great that he's getting some shine right now because I think this trilogy is definitely worth it. So anything that gives people motivation to pick up this trilogy and read it, I think is worthwhile. Okay, that's all I have to say. Have you read this trilogy? Have you read any of them? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about slashers in general and what you think the state of the slasher genre is, especially post-Scream. You know, Scream really changed the game, not just for film, but also for novels. And then, as I said, Stephen Graham Jones' The Angel of Indian Lake trilogy, which finished up last year, also kind of set a new benchmark for what it means to have this meta-analysis and to be living in a slasher movie or a slasher novel. Like, how do you go about embodying these tropes without making them feel old or tired? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, about the genre in general, and if you have any other recommendations, old or new, that play with those ideas or those thoughts or those tropes. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.